Next month, it will be 3 years since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. The war has killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians and devastated the country. Now, following the election of US President Donald Trump, there may just be an opportunity for some kind of peace deal. When faced with a conflict with such tragic human toll, it can seem callous to talk about economic statistics. Yet the future direction of the war and any settlement depends in large part on whether Ukraine and Russia can afford to keep fighting. And any peace deal will also have to tackle the question of how much it costs Ukraine to rebuild itself and who pays for that. So this week on the Big View podcast, we're going to tackle the economics of war and peace in Ukraine. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest questions in economics, finance, and business. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen. And I'm very excited to bring you a special show. The first episode of The Big View to be recorded in front of a live audience. I'm in the Swiss mountain town of Davos, covering the World Economic Forum, the annual jamboree where business and political leaders gather to do deals and debate big issues. My guest in Davos is Timofey Milovanov. Timofey is a former Ukrainian economy minister and the president of the Kiev School of Economics, which has published extensive research on the impact of the war on both Ukraine and Russia, the effectiveness of sanctions, and much else. Timofey Milovanov, welcome to the Big View podcast.
Thank you.
So there's a lot to talk about, but I'd like to start maybe just by zooming out a little bit. We're approaching the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, with all the human tragedy and devastation that has involved. And it's always sometimes maybe feels a bit insensitive or cold to be talking about the economy at the moment. But obviously it's important to the war effort and to any discussion about what happens next in Ukraine in terms of peace and reconstruction. So how would you assess the state of Ukraine's economy right now?
So indeed, it's usually sort of strange to talk about the economy during the war. People say we should focus on the existential threat, which is defense, work with the military. But the point is that the interaction of the two economies, actually, Russian and Ukrainian, matter. Because if your economy or Russian economy, if Ukrainian economy or Russian economy are likely to implode, that creates an incentives, to come to the table. And it's true for Putin and it's true for Zelensky. So that's always in the background. And in fact, it's not as so much the issue of resilience or the issue of logistics to the front line. That's what people focus on. It's more of the chance of a collapse in the economy, which would put you in an extremely vulnerable strategic situation then. So when we talk about Ukrainian economy, we should compare it with the state of the Russian economy if we are talking about the situation today in the war. So what we see is, it's probably maybe not the public opinion, but if you talk to intelligence, at least some of the conversations I've been a part to, you see that there is a consensus that structural issues have been accumulating in Russian economy. And so some of the threats or some of the numbers they put out don't really respond to the reality. Now, that doesn't guarantee that there would be a crisis tomorrow, because there is this famous joke, I'm an economist by training, so we have a joke. Out of last 3 financial crises, we have predicted 8. So, you need a trigger for a crisis. And the trigger might be, loss of revenue for oil and gas for Russia. That would trigger, or a bank run. That would trigger an economic collapse, or at least a crisis. Putin would know it, would see it up front, and would come to the table earlier. The same is true for Ukraine. Ukraine economy is resilient because people are resilient. Because people who wanted to move or live, they've left. and people who are staying in Ukraine, they're there for the duration of the war. It's been 3 years, it's going to be 3.5, 4 years, 5 years. Economy is working, businesses are working. What does it rely on? It relies on international support, because all our taxes go to the military effort. So all the pensions, social benefits, healthcare, education, all of that has to be paid by support. We either borrow or we get grants. And so that could also be a trigger. A substantive decrease in international support could be a trigger to create a collapse or a risk of implosion of Ukrainian economy. So in that sense, Ukrainian economy is more robust right now, but look at the geopolitics of this. The trigger is more likely. What is more likely in the world, that the Western world or the entire world come together and stop buying oil and gas from Russia, or that Ukrainian financial support from the EU and the US and Canada, all the free world, will be decreased? Now, so the trigger is more likely on Ukrainian economy, whereas the situation is more difficult for the Russian economy. So that's the economy situation. At the same time, Ukraine has been very pragmatic, and allies have been very pragmatic, and Ukraine has accumulated sufficient support for this year and a good chunk of support into the 2026. So even if tomorrow President Trump or President Macron or whoever decides to pull a plug on Ukrainian support completely, Ukraine has enough in the buffer to go on for at least a year and a half. So in that sense, Ukrainian economy is doing well, and it would be great if Russian economy would be doing worse.
So, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think we'll come back to some of these things. But just coming back to that idea of collapse, I think most people would have thought, given what happened in 2022, that there would be some sort of economic collapse in Ukraine. And obviously, you talked about the support that's come from the West in grants and loans. Is that really the thing that has kept the economy afloat? Or are there other things that have happened that have surprised people in terms of the resilience of the Ukrainian economy?
No, the dynamics here matters. On the first day of the war, you expect a bank run. And if the bank, if there is a run on the banking system, people are not getting money, people are losing their savings, the currency is devalued, the inflation, you go into hyperinflation on the first day of the war, you lose trust in the economy. And so no matter, no amount of international support coming 2 months from now, because it needs timing, will help you. There'll be nothing to save. So economy depends on expectations as well as on fundamentals. And what happened in Ukraine is, in many ways, that we have relived that before, in 2014, 2016. When Crimea was annexed, when Russia invaded Donbass, the east of Ukraine, for the first time, that time, Ukraine economy did crash. Currency devalued, lost 2/3 of the value over a very short period of time. Inflation skyrocketed. We had the bank run. Government had to clean up the banking system. We lost almost 100 banks out of 200 banks. All the structural problems we had, like improper governance in banks, improper capitalizations, NPLs, non-performing loans, simply fraud, issues with the budget, with the state procurement, all those structural issues which are now accumulating, in fact, in Russian economy, they've been there in Ukrainian economy in 2014.
So you'd had a sort of stress test already.
Vaccination, I would call it vaccination. We had a, economic crisis, which in fact, counterintuitively, or maybe not so counterintuitively, prepared us for the 2022 invasion.
But as you said, the support is still very large, right? I think, and these are numbers, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I got these from your institute, so hopefully they're right.
They must be right then.
But, the budget deficit was $70 billion in 2024. Foreign loans covered 80% of that. So, it is, there's a big war effort, obviously, and it's very expensive, and it's dependent on loans. So, and in terms of the sort of the package that's been put in place, what was that? I think $75 billion and another 18 or something like that. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. That's about, so up to, over 70, up to 100 in commitments right now. Ukraine requires about 40 plus, like give or take throughout the war. if you look at over the 3 years, it's always about 38, 36, 40, 42 billion dollars. These are the numbers which keep Ukrainian economy afloat. Of course, if the front situation is going to be deteriorating or something else, some other macro shocks will happen, then we might need to have more money. But that the amount of money which gives you sufficient, you basically, we're not really looking at the situation that 3 months from now we're going to have a problem. Plus we have another 40, 50 in central bank reserves. So in fact, Ukraine is ready for a couple of years in terms of liquidity, even if the support is stopped today.
Yeah, so it's almost like a sort of stockpile of money in the same way as you would stockpile armaments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people work. There is a lot of. So, in fact, this new administration coming in, Trump election, gave a push to a lot of institutions and a lot of governments around the world to sort of front load support and front load it in such a way that, unlike the USAID, it cannot be stopped, with an executive order or for the next 30 days or something like that. So people have been working day and night just in case to ensure that Ukraine's support is continuous. We have seen two things. One is that we have learned this lesson in 2022 in July, when Ukrainian economy actually had to devalue its currency because the commitments were there, but the liquidity was not. It was the timing issue. So, promises were, but a bit later, and it was unstable and unstructured, and the expectations were that the promises would be delivered earlier. Mm-hmm. So Ukraine had to monetize the budget deficit against those promises, and then actually had to devalue. So that was not good for Ukraine, but maybe some devaluation during the war is of course justified. Maybe, so that's a separate discussion. The second one, Ursula von der Leyen, 2 years ago in the summer at Ukraine recovery conference came out with the idea to insulate European support from European political cycle or disruptions which can happen within specific countries. And so they committed a longer term package or midterm until 2027 with 50 billion euros. So that package is in place, plus just the last time effort or last ditch effort was 50 billion against the Russian assets collateralized. So people have worked over the last 6 months or more to ensure that Ukraine is relatively okay financially. So I think that is not the vulnerability at the moment.
Right. So let's talk about Russia. I remember when the war broke out, and then immediately afterwards, there was what can only be described as a sort of barrage of sanctions from the West, really much more than people had expected, right? So the sanctions on removing Russian banks from the SWIFT banking payment system, sanctions on oligarchs, sanctions on all kinds of things, and also a lot of Western companies pulling out of Russia. And I remember at the time thinking, this is going to bring the Russian economy to its knees very quickly. I mean, maybe I was wrong, but clearly I was wrong. But why didn't that happen? Do you think? What was the reason why Russia sort of managed to avoid a crisis?
Well, it's easy to explain it ex post. We can always. Economists are fantastic at explaining what has happened, and really bad at predicting what should or will happen. So of course I'm happy, I like the question of explain why the Russian economy didn't collapse much better than the question when will Russian economy collapse. Okay,
yes, you're on safer ground.
Happened, yeah, we can always rationalize what happened, but the rough theory behind that is that if you do sanctions, you don't want to smooth them out, you don't want to roll out them gradually, you want to have a shock, both in terms of fundamental effect on the economy, but also in terms of expectations. You want to overwhelm the expectations in the economy. If you use salami tactics, the economy adjusts. Economies are very strong, or most economies are very strong because they use substitution effects. And people underestimate these substitution effects. Look at the German economy. There are all these doomsday scenarios that once the Russian gas is out, the pricing will be so high that the entire country will go into a recession. Didn't happen. If you look at it a bit more carefully, the immediately affected industries did suffer. Those who consumed the gas, actually. But the industries which consumed the products produced by those industries then switched and substituted and used different technologies. And so The same effect happened actually when in 2014, 2016, Russia denied the ability of Ukraine to export from Mariupol. Mariupol was under control, but the ability to export, they built a Kerch bridge, they started harassing the trade routes. So, we actually lost 50% of our ports. The GDP effect was 1%, 1.5%. Surprising. Everyone was shocked in Ukraine when we modeled it because the substitution effect, people just substituted the logistics. So the same is true here. So you have to hit hard and at once that people panic. Basically, you need to generate loss of trust. Instead, what the administrations around the world, including the Biden administration, they have chosen this gradualism, the gradual approach. Wait and see. But the same is true for the Russian economy. If we give them time to adjust, they will adjust. So I think that's a fundamental error. I would rather have sanctions be delayed a little bit, package 1, 2, 3, and 4, but then done at once.
Mm-hmm. So, but the other thing that people say is that sanctions haven't really been as effective as we thought. And, we've seen all the reports of, cars, suddenly exports of cars to Georgia have gone through the roof, or, and so there's...
That's a substitution, by the way, effect, right? You substitute the route, right? You bypass the sanctions.
Right. But so there are goods getting to Russia in roundabout ways that so you can't be completely sort of effective in that sense. Is that one of the reasons that Russia's managed to sort of hold up?
They're very good at building infrastructure to bypassing whatever the West or the coalition throws at them, be it informational or economic warfare or military. They adapt. Look at how fast they adapt on the battleground. Look how fast they adapt on bypassing whatever the sanctions are. So it's a continuous process. You find that they adapt, you adapt. You have to impose new sanctions all the time. For example, with oil and gas price cap, people said it might or might not work. In the end, Russia created this shadow fleet, which bypasses the price cap sanctions.
These are the tankers.
Yeah, the tankers, which are basically uninsured. There are details and procedures behind the working of the price cap, but the idea is that it should be enforced through the insurance. So Russia started using uninsured tankers. So what are you gonna enforce? Okay, if they're not using the mechanism, which is your enforcement mechanism. So what you do, you can easily harass these tankers. You can demand insurance to pass through certain types of waters. Now, so you have to pass that legislation, or you have to get your navy to actually enforce that. If you're willing to do it, that's gonna hit Russia. If you are unwilling to do it, if you try to create sanctions, so imagine the sanctions like visually. One sanction is something has to be written in a contract. Basically, it's insurance sanction. Something else, you stop the tanker, or you harass the tanker. Navy stops the tanker. That's a very different type of sanction. In the end, they rely on the trading routes which go through European NATO waters. North and south. So definitely NATO has the ability and Europe has the ability to enforce the sanctions, whatever those sanctions are. The question is there a willingness to do it? Because some politicians, including, top politicians, want to play two things at once. They want to sort of impose sanctions and they want to allow the trade in oil. You can't have both. You can't. Of course, sanctions are ineffective if someone is afraid to stop trading with Russia in oil. So,
Well, and I think what you're saying is it was an election year in the United States and the oil price,
It's been 3 election years, apparently, in the United States throughout this war. And the administration there was afraid to be hard on Russia, partly because it was afraid, in my view, to deal with the consequences. And partly because, indeed, there were worries, justified or not, that the price at the pump will go up.
Yeah. So, and this is very important. I think you again, this is from the Kiev School. 90% of crude exports from Russia leave through the shadow fleet. So it's very important. Just one detail on that. There was one of the last actions of the Biden administration was to impose extra sanctions on that fleet. How do you assess that? Is that going to make a difference?
A little bit in a short period, of course. Apparently, the prices did go up. I think the Treasury nominee complained about it during the hearing, saying apparently what's bad for the Biden administration is good for us because they were afraid to impose the sanctions. They imposed it in the last weeks. Price at the pump goes up. Okay, so maybe it's not so bad after all. So there is politics there definitely, and I that's the point with democracies. You want Zelensky has the same problem. He needs to have to impose mobilization. And I'm here talking from a position of privilege, being able to travel, and speak to you in Davos. And, while our analysts are being recruited on the street, being stopped and sent to from the Kiev School of Economics to military to serve in infantry, and they might die. So, this is very tough. People die. A lot of infantry dies. I have a driver here, a soldier. He is after three times wounded. The guy who just drove us here, Ukrainian driver. He's been decommissioned. Half of his unit, he said, half of people I knew are dead, not even wounded. So infantry suffers losses. You in order to fight, you should be able to do what Putin does. No matter what, send tens of thousands of people to die, and that's his production function, basically. Stupid, ridiculous, horrendous, tragic production function, but that's his economy today. He takes humans, his own humans, kills them. In democracy, you can't take your own humans at that rate and kill them. That's the point is that the value of life in democracy is very different than the value of life in non-democracy, particularly in Russia. I mean, we as economists, as people, we don't talk about it, but there's, of course, imputed value of life. And the imputed value of life in Ukraine is much higher than, imputed value of life in Russia, because he sends these people, daily in thousands to die. Doesn't matter to Russia, matters to Ukraine. So from the militarily production perspective, we take the cynical approach. That's a vulnerability of Ukraine. Democracies have difficult time fighting well exactly because they're democracies. There are political process in the United States. Zelensky is constrained by his population. He's not to create gulags to fight Russia. We in fact are trying to avoid that, right? We would become Russia if we fought like Russia.
Yeah. So let's talk about the possibility of some sort of deal. I mean, the election of Donald Trump obviously is focused attention on this, as you said. We're now roughly 48 hours into Donald Trump's presidency. It's clear that his promise to end the war on day one will not be met. But tell us a bit about how you think about this in Ukraine. Is speed a handicap or an advantage?
So in my view, in my personal view, the way I read the news is that the fact that there is no fast deal is good for Ukraine. Because at this point, President Trump doesn't really have that much leverage over Russia yet. And the only deal possible is to use leverage against us, Ukrainians, get demands from Russia, meet those, and use leverage so that we agree. Why is that? Well, it's because when you work with, if I have a friend or business partner, I have a relationship, I have more leverage. If I've met you for the first time or I had no conversation with you, I don't have much leverage over you. I have to figure out where you stand, to be able to start thinking about your vulnerabilities or what I can promise to you. So in that sense, my reading is that the fact that they're now speaking seriously about, let's say, 100 days or even 6 months, that brings more realism to the situation, and it's good news for Ukraine.
And what sort of, so talk a bit about the leverage on both sides. So how would Trump, if that was the way they were thinking about it, how would the US go about building up leverage, and on the Ukrainian side, but also over Russia?
So on Ukrainian side, you build direct leverage, which is financial military support, and indirect leverage through Europe and other allies of Ukraine. And so that's pretty straightforward. And then over Russia, it's the same story. You have to threaten it. We just read together, I think, the Trump Truth Social post. Apparently, it's confirmed, I've been told, that he threatens tariffs and taxes and everything, on Russia and sanctions. I would like to know how he's going to tax Russia. Well, he didn't quite say that, but
and as we've learned with Donald Trump, everything he says he does 100%, right? So.
Yeah, including 24 hours, deal, right? So, but that's rhetoric, and rhetoric is both positive, that we respect Russia, we don't want to fight, but there's sort of, an easy way and a tough way, and an easy way is to just get to the deal now, and a tough way is, not to get to the deal, and then, we'll have to force you. So I'm pretty sure that the Trump administration right now is looking really hard and very sort of intensely at finding leverage, finding intelligence, finding ways to sort of ensure that this deal is going to happen and this deal is not going to collapse soon enough. The problem for the Trump administration, I think, is that it's the first year of the Trump administration. They cannot do a sort of Afghani deal. And if they're going to do a deal which is going to collapse a year or two from now, and unfortunately, Putin can't help himself, if the deal is such that he's going to be tempted to move again on Ukraine, he will. He is also aging. He has internal pressures. Things are not getting easier for him. So he will take that chance. So very likely, whatever will be, either the war will continue or there will be a deal which is unstable and the war will restart. That will still be on the Trump's term. So it will be on him, and it's gonna make him look not very different from Biden administration. And so I think that's what they are willing or want to avoid. And that requires some kind of stable deal. Stable deal on both sides. You don't want Ukraine to go another revolution because the deal is taking away sovereignty that people will take to the streets now, Let's say military is disarmed, I don't think Zelensky will buy it, but let's say, something happens, in a parallel universe. But basically we'll have another revolution. There will be a massive, it's going to be another tens of millions of refugees from Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of displaced, tens of thousands killed, that's going to be another major issue. So no one wants that. And I think in order to avoid that, you actually have to find a way which meets minimal conditions on both sides. So Trump needs to, or Trump administration have to figure out the real minimal conditions for Ukraine, that the deal will be accepted, and the minimal real conditions for Russia, that the deal will be accepted.
And is there a common ground?
Yeah, my take on this, there is a common ground. And the common ground is basically Ukraine wants stability in the future. And I'm not going to speak for Putin because I'm not, an expert on that. But what I've heard from Putin, or from experts who's not from Putin, for experts who study Putin, and have been informed about this, is that their minimal conditions actually are not that bad. All this talk about disarming Ukraine, that's basically instability, right? So that's not a minimal condition. There could be something on NATO. There could be something on packaging. There's definitely demand on the territories that currently are occupied. But, I don't think they're going to be demanding. They might try, but I don't think they're going to be demanding that Ukraine gives up Kyiv and gives it to Russia, or even, unoccupied territories, or gives up military. In the end of the day, they will try. If it works, great for them, bad for the world. But they will try. But I think there is a trade actually there.
And just to be clear, when you said on NATO, the idea would be a condition that Ukraine does not become a member of NATO.
Also, you have to find a way where on paper it's not NATO, but in terms of capabilities, it's pretty close to that.
Yeah, well, so we're in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and President Zelensky said that when we were talking about security guarantees, he talked about at least 200,000 European peacekeeping troops. I mean, for context, that's roughly the size of the French armed forces. I mean, that's quite a lot.
Well, so there are 2 points to that. Right now, everyone is making demands to increase their bargaining position, starting position. The second point is, with all the NATO, basically, I'm not so sure that the military which is willing to fight. So imagine we have 1,000 French troops somewhere in Ukraine, just a unit, a battalion. Imagine Russians are seriously attacking. They took North Koreans and they're marching. What would that battalion do? Would they retreat? or would they fight? I think they would retreat, actually.
Mm.
So, you can put 50,000 people there, and if they all are willing to retreat when the Russians start marching, I'm not sure what kind of
It doesn't really,
security guarantee that is. You actually clog your logistics,
Yeah.
because these guys are running. In fact, we have had units like that, which were in Ukraine, and we've seen embassies, we've seen people just retreat. Sometimes embassies leave simply because Putin said something. Areshnik, and half of the advisors or whoever retreat. And that's not a deterrence to anything. If you can put a tweet, or do a press conference and the troops are already retreating, So in that sense, I think Ukrainian troops are much more less vulnerable to the idea of retreat, okay? But they need technology, they need logistics, they need defense capability, they need intelligence, they need support. So I think the realistic guarantees, and I don't mean politics, I mean what is needed that the front line doesn't move, no matter what happens, is a combination of technology, intelligence, and humans. Humans are likely to be Ukrainians, but of course it would be good to have, people who can serve in the rear, maybe, some peacekeepers can provide some services, which otherwise would free Ukrainians. So you can discuss that, has to be packaged. But the other point, I think, which is very important, is that Putin put himself in a position that as he achieves better success on the battlefield in Ukraine, he decreases his strategic options. So if he is isolated now, and he is becoming almost strategically fully dependent on China. That means if he uses a nuke, if he bombs Kyiv, if he takes another 2 large cities, the Western companies will be a little bit less eager to work with Russia on margin.
Mm.
So that means he will be a little bit more dependent on China. And so that's not what he wants. Similarly, like we in the West don't want him to be a close ally of China, we want him to be played, in between. In fact, we want to play China versus Russia and the other way around. Similarly, Putin would like to play West against China in his own strategic mindset. And so at this point, no matter the administration who is in Washington or in Brussels or in London, his successes on the battlefield mean that his strategic options of more independence from China actually not happening. So he needs to cut a deal too. Now, that's his thinking. I have no idea. I'm a game theorist. That's what a game theorist would think. But that doesn't mean, I'm not a politician. I'm not, I have not been in shoes of these guys who are making decisions. So they could be, it could be very different.
Okay, well, let's take a positive view and say there is some sort of deal and some peace. Obviously, one of the big financial economic questions is the reconstruction of Ukraine, and I think various organizations have tried to estimate during the course of the war what this would cost. Obviously, the numbers keep going up. How do you think, just in broad terms, about that question, the cost and how it would be financed?
So I think the danger there is that everyone would want to build back better, of course, that's the mantra, but still build back, okay? So for example, if you look at, a farmland, okay? Farmland is now contaminated by mines. So what do we expect to do? We expect to teach the farmers or, give them technology to demine their land, and then we need to clean it environmentally, and then we'll help them with seeds and support, and we'll bring them back. But maybe it's better that we put solar over it and run robots, and don't demine at all. A robot explodes, big deal, we'll put another one. I don't think that thinking is there. So there's no forward thinking on all these development agencies, reconstruction agencies. We're not thinking what is going to be in the world of AI, new energy, new geopolitics, critical supply chains, critical materials, strategic priorities, how it's going to work, and what the role of Ukraine is. With the, I'm not saying AI, I don't know what's going to happen with AI, not my field, but definitely tech is important.
I mean, that doesn't stop everybody else in Davos from talking about AI, by the way. So you should feel free to...
Oh, yeah, in that case, okay, here's the vision, Yeah, I've been to a number, right? It's like, look, it's the AI, right? Yeah. Well, so yeah, but I think that's one concern I have, and where I will do what I can and more to actually shift the thinking about this. But in practical terms, it's a pipeline. It's the absorption capacity. It's getting relationships going now, the feasibility studies, insurance. There is a lot of groundwork which is happening. I've just moderated a panel on Ukraine recovery. We'll have another, panel tomorrow. There is a lot of work being done. There's Ukraine recovery conference this year in Italy with a proper strategy being prepared. So there is some work done, and it's a lot of it's a basic foundational groundwork. But we do close some deals surprisingly during the war.
Yeah.
So there is some investment going on.
Yeah. We need to wrap up, but there's one thing I want to get your view on, which is this question of the $300 billion roughly of Russian central bank assets, which are frozen in the West, mostly in Belgium, for various reasons. I mean, the West has already agreed to use the interest from those assets to help fund Ukraine. But obviously there is also a view that says we should just take those assets and use them to help Ukraine or to rebuild Ukraine. How do you think about that question? And how would you persuade the European central bankers and politicians who are nervous about doing that? How would you persuade them to do it?
So I think the regulators, the central bankers, have been not a progressive force or helpful force on this. They're basically saying, we're going to lose trust in the currency because, we confiscated. Do we want people to invest in our economies? People who start wars, I think we have to be clear. So, we actually want to confiscate it, that people who want to leverage our systems and do horrendous things which are threatening the security order in the entire, globe, so that people, don't even have access to the financial systems. I think that's my view.
Yeah.
That's not the bankers' view. The bankers' view is more trade is better. So there's this view. There are two competing views. One competing view is like international trade will solve everything. The other view is we should only trade with democratic countries, okay? Because there's national security concerns. And the second view is now becoming a little bit more prominent, both with the Trump administration and even with MAGA coming in, but also with the war in Ukraine, or with Israel or with Middle East. So, people weaponize economics, and you have to protect with that. Now, I also think that sort of Putin doesn't believe he will see this money anymore. It's really a political issue how it's packaged because, he cannot be embarrassed that the money is confiscated, the funds are confiscated. Because if he is embarrassed, that he has to do something about it. So I think the talk, direct confiscation is actually is not realistic because of those concerns. But at the same time, I can't imagine a bureaucrat who will sign a release of money, of funds back to Putin without courts, repatriation, So the money is stuck. And it's very likely there'll be a way to finance reconstruction. Why? Because people will ask a question, why should we pay our taxpayers' money if Russian money is here? That's, it's double jeopardy. It's double unfair. So I think the fundamentals, the gravity forces are there, but it takes some leadership and packaging, political packaging to get it going.
Yes, well, I think that's a good way to sum up this entire conversation, actually. That's all we have time for, but I want to thank you very much for joining. That's been really fascinating, and I want to thank all of you for listening in and for being here for this first and hopefully not last live recording of the Big View podcast. Timofey Milovanov, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning in to the first live recording of The Big View. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasic in London, with invaluable help from the Reuters events team on the ground in Davos. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. Don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, Views Room, every Thursday, as well as other great podcasts from the Reuters team. And if you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.